When I first opened the Samuel Little file, the weight of it was not measured by the inches of paper inside, nor by the number of tabs, subfolders, and archived reports stacked one on top of another. The weight came from what was missing: entire lives reduced to a few faded photographs, evidence logs with entire sections left blank, case numbers with no narrative summary, and dozens of women marked only as Jane Doe, as if anonymity were the final verdict handed to them by the world. I had seen difficult files before, but this one felt different. This one felt like a cold wind, blowing from a decade I had never lived in, a reminder that evil rarely disappears. It simply waits. My name is Miller Files, and I have spent my life investigating people who walk through society with the quiet confidence of ghosts. Men who slip between jurisdictions, between lives, between the cracks of systems that are supposed to protect us. Samuel Little was one of them, perhaps the most successful among them, if one were cruel enough to measure success in bodies. The FBI said he confessed to 93 killings, and when I first read that number, I did not believe it. Not because it was impossible, but because the human brain instinctively refuses to accept certain magnitudes of horror. When devastation becomes too large, we round it down in our minds. We make it manageable. We pretend it cannot be real. But with Samuel Little, the closer I looked, the more real everything became. I remember sitting at my desk the night I began reviewing the first wave of materials from Los Angeles, the city where 3 of his confirmed murders occurred. Outside my window, traffic hummed like a restless ocean. A siren wailed somewhere downtown, and under that soundscape, I imagined the breath of a killer drifting through the same streets 3 decades earlier. Los Angeles in the late 80s had a different personality. There were corners of the city that the rest of the world ignored, narrow alleys where the law arrived slowly and left quickly. Some parts of the city were loud with neon, while others were quiet with fear. Women disappeared there, and sometimes no one noticed. As I leafed through the autopsy reports from 1987 and 1989, the words repeated themselves with mechanical consistency. Cause of death: strangulation. No signs of weapon involvement. Body discovered outdoors. Toxicology inconclusive. Case entered into cold storage due to lack of suspect. There was an eerie sameness about these reports, as if they were written by the same invisible hand, or as if death itself had adopted a pattern too subtle for detectives of the time to see. It was only years later, when DNA became the compass guiding us through old mysteries, that those reports found their way back into the light. But long before DNA, the story began elsewhere. To understand Samuel Little, you must travel back to the 1970s, to the highways and cheap motels where he drifted from state to state, carrying with him little more than a duffel bag and an instinct for identifying vulnerability. He did not hunt the wealthy or the well-protected. He hunted those society had already abandoned. Women living on the margins, women struggling with addiction, women without stable homes, women whose disappearances would not echo through the news cycle. These were the victims he chose not out of preference, but because he recognized something few killers articulate aloud. He understood silence. He knew where it existed, whom it surrounded, and how long it lingered after a body vanished. If you want to grasp the full horror of his crimes, imagine America not as a single country, but as a constellation of disconnected jurisdictions. A homicide in Louisiana did not speak to a homicide in Nevada. A Jane Doe found behind a dumpster in Ohio did not send a ripple reaching California. Database technologies were primitive. Communication between departments depended on phone calls, faxes, and memory. Unless two detectives happened to compare notes at the right time, no one connected the dots. Samuel Little exploited this fragmentation with a predator's intuition. You could almost say the country itself helped him disappear. But all of that comes later. When I entered the investigation, the man himself was already in custody, old, frail, and living in the twilight years of a life built on stolen breath. He had been arrested in 2012 on a narcotics charge in Kentucky, and when his fingerprints and DNA entered the system, they woke up the ghosts of Los Angeles. I often wonder what went through his mind as the walls began to close in. Did he fear the truth finally catching up to him? Or did he feel relief? Some killers long to be recognized, even if recognition comes in handcuffs. Before I met him or reviewed his interviews, I wanted to understand the victims, not as police files or evidence tags, but as individuals. Who were they? What did they dream of? Who missed them when they disappeared? I spent hours staring at black and white photographs taken by crime scene technicians decades before I became a detective. In those grainy images, I saw women who deserved far more than the endings they received. I saw lives interrupted, stories erased, hopes stranded somewhere between sunset and nightfall. And I knew that to tell the truth about Samuel Little, we had to resurrect their stories first. But resurrection is delicate work. For every victim with a name, there were others still unidentified. The FBI would later publish dozens of portraits, drawn by Little himself, haunting sketches of women he claimed to have killed. The details were unsettling, not because of their accuracy, but because of the intimacy within them. A killer should not remember his victims so well. And yet, he did. He remembered their faces, their hair, their quiet expressions, as if memory were his final possession. In one of the earliest interviews I studied, he described approaching a woman at a bar. His tone was casual, almost conversational, as if recounting an old road trip. That disturbed me most. Evil that whispers is more terrifying than evil that shouts. There was no rage in his accounts, no frenzy, no theatrics, only routine. He spoke of murder as if he were recounting a familiar habit, and habit can be more dangerous than hatred. The FBI analysts who reviewed his confessions said they were credible. Those analysts were not easily convinced. They cross-checked his accounts against weather records, street maps from the era, demolition dates of certain buildings, clothing styles visible in old photos. Every time a detail matched, the circle around truth tightened. When I read their notes, I knew I was standing before a rare kind of predator, one who did not need recognition, but remembered everything anyway, one who traveled America as if carrying a ledger only he could read. For this first episode, I want to take you with me through the earliest stages of the investigation, when the fog was thickest and every lead felt like a whisper. Picture me in a dimly lit records room, fluorescent lights flickering overhead as I sort through boxes labeled with years that now feel impossibly distant. 1987, 1989, 1974, each year a door, each door a body. I trace the pattern the way a cartographer traces rivers. The murders are spaced across states: Florida, Mississippi, Nevada, Texas, California, Illinois. From 1970 to 2005, he crisscrossed the map like a needle stitching a grim tapestry. And yet the country barely felt the thread pulling through. That is the most haunting part. Not just that he killed so many, but that the world barely noticed. The earliest potential cases point to a young man drifting restless, carrying childhood wounds and adult addictions. I will not attempt to psychoanalyze him. I am not here to offer excuses or diagnoses. But sometimes understanding where a man came from helps understand the shadows he walked into. Little grew up in an unstable environment, frequently in trouble, drifting through petty crime, alcohol, and violence. But many men grow up in hardship without becoming predators. The leap from suffering to cruelty is not inevitable. That leap belongs entirely to him. In the first set of interviews, he never once expressed remorse. That is something the public often misunderstands. They expect breakdowns, tears, apologies, cinematic climaxes where truth crashes down like thunder. But most serial killers are not like that. They do not regret. They do not break. They simply recount their crimes because talking about them feels like revisiting old trophies stored in a dusty attic. Little was no exception. He spoke with a painter's pride, recalling the contours of the women he later sketched. He behaved almost as if he believed he had given them some form of immortality by remembering them. But memory is not justice. Memory is not redemption. As a detective, I have learned that the first stage of a major cold case investigation is not finding suspects. It is finding clarity, and clarity begins with understanding patterns. Little strangled his victims, often with his bare hands. He left limited physical evidence. Many victims were misclassified as overdose cases, and because he targeted women who lived transient lives, their disappearances rarely triggered large-scale searches. This is the painful truth that sits at the core of this case. A serial killer thrived, not because he was brilliant, but because society failed those who needed it most. By the time I finished the first night of research, I felt something heavy settle on my shoulders. It was not fear. Fear is sharp and quick. This was something slower, something like sorrow. Sorrow for what had been overlooked. Sorrow for what had been lost. Sorrow for what had been lost. Sorrow for what we would never fully recover. And yet, sorrow is not the enemy of investigation. Indifference is. I knew then that this case required not just logic but devotion. Someone had to speak for the victims. Someone had to piece their stories back together. Someone had to make the country listen at last. So I began with the confirmed murders in Los Angeles. Carol Alford, killed in July 1987. Audrey Nelson, killed in August 1989. Guadalupe Podaca, killed in September 1989. I stared at their photographs, not to intrude on their final moments, but to remind myself that behind every data point was a woman with laughter, memories, and a life that deserved to continue. When the DNA linked Little to their cases, it became the spark that ignited a nationwide reckoning. From the moment his DNA matched, the investigative world began to vibrate like a struck wire. Cold case units in multiple states reopened files. Analysts cross-checked timelines. Rangers in Texas interviewed him for hours, working against the clock as his health deteriorated. Each confession expanded the map, and each confirmation deepened the tragedy. This first chapter of the documentary you are listening to is not about the climax of the case. It is about the beginning of truth. It is about walking into the quiet rooms where forgotten evidence sleeps. It is about hearing the faint echoes of stories silenced for too long. It is about the flicker of realization that sometimes the dead speak only when the living are finally ready to listen. As I sit here now, recounting these early steps, I imagine the women whose faces appear in those old photographs. I imagine their voices. I imagine the future they never reached. And I remind myself that justice, even delayed, must still arrive. Not for Samuel Little, but for them. This is the beginning, the first step into a labyrinth built across decades. And I, Miller Files, will walk it slowly with you. Because before we confront the man who confessed to 93 murders, we must confront the world that allowed those murders to disappear into silence. This is episode 1, and the truth is only starting to rise from the darkness. When the world finally learned Samuel Little's name, it was already too late for dozens of women whose stories had faded into dust. But for investigators like me, the realization came with a second, quieter truth. The real mystery behind Samuel Little was not simply how he killed, but how he survived as a threat for so long without the alarm bells of law enforcement ringing loud enough to stop him. This second chapter of our journey dives into the slow unraveling that followed his 2012 arrest and the peculiar challenge of extracting truth from a man who had spent his entire life navigating the shadows. I remember the first time I watched the unedited interview footage recorded by Texas Ranger James Holland, one of the few investigators who managed to draw confessions from Little with something close to cooperation. Holland did not interrogate him with threats or force. Instead, he approached him with an unusual blend of patience and curiosity, as though listening to an aging storyteller recount decades of forgotten folklore. It was a striking thing to witness, because the stories were not folklore at all. They were the final testimonies of women whose lives had been wiped from the map. Little sat slouched in his wheelchair, his wrists thin, his voice gravelly from age. If you didn't know who he was, you might mistake him for a harmless old man recounting his youth. He spoke of states and cities with the rhythm of a long-haul trucker: Miami, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Las Vegas. The names rolled off his tongue like stops on a bus route. He remembered the curves of highways and the smell of bars by the coast. He remembered the color of a woman's blouse, the shape of her jawline, the last conversation he had before her life disappeared. Listening to him was a disturbing paradox. His tone was gentle, his details were intimate, his crimes were monstrous. The trickiest part of building a case from such interviews is understanding the difference between memory and myth. Some killers embellish their stories, painting themselves larger than life, but Samuel Little's recollections did not expand his legend. They deepened his darkness. The specificity of his memory was chilling. He remembered victims law enforcement barely had records for. He remembered scenes no newspaper had ever reported. But memory is not proof. In the world of homicide investigation, a confession alone is not a verdict. Every word he spoke had to be tested, strained, weighed against the few scraps of evidence remaining after 30 or 40 years of erosion. As I reviewed the transcripts, I felt as if I were sifting through the sediment of American history, brushing away layers of neglect, one detail at a time. Every city he mentioned became a new search. Every year he referenced became a flashlight shining into a long-forgotten box in an evidence vault. When he described a particular alley behind a nightclub in 1982, investigators pulled aerial photos and city planning maps from that era. When he explained how a woman wore a necklace with a broken clasp, forensic teams re-examined items cataloged decades before. The more I traced his words, the more I realized the tragic truth of the Samuel Little case. He had not been hiding from the system. The system had simply never been looking for him. But as more states reopened cold cases, another challenge emerged: his mobility. Samuel Little moved constantly. He drifted, hitchhiked, stole cars, slept in abandoned buildings, rented cheap motel rooms under false names, and vanished before anyone thought to ask questions. His freedom came from unpredictability. He was not the type of serial offender who stayed tied to a single hunting ground. He was an ocean current, always moving, always circling, always returning to the same kinds of victims, but never the same geographical location twice in a row. This meant that no single police department had a full picture of his crimes. Each jurisdiction witnessed no more than a fraction of his violence. A detective in Louisiana might have seen a body dumped near a swamp. A detective in California might have investigated a murdered woman found behind a supermarket. A detective in Ohio might have struggled to identify a Jane Doe near a highway exit. None of them had reason to believe their cases connected across thousands of miles. Little understood that he did not have to be brilliant to avoid capture. He only had to let geography do the work for him. One night, deep into reviewing the investigative backlog, I found myself staring at a map pinned to my office wall. Colored flags marked the locations of potential victims: blue for confirmed, red for suspected, yellow for those awaiting further review. The map looked like a patient covered in pinpricks. The spread was overwhelming. Florida alone held several cases. Mississippi had others. Texas was dotted with flags like stars in a dark sky. Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois. He moved across America like a shadow flickering at the edge of a candle flame, leaving tragedy in his wake long before anyone realized a pattern existed. Cold cases require discipline and restraint. With a suspect like Little, the temptation is to accept every confession as truth. But that is not how justice works. We needed corroboration. Investigators began contacting coroners, requesting old autopsy photos, digitizing handwritten notes, and tracking down retired detectives. Some of these retired officers were in their 70s or 80s, stunned that a case they once handled in their youth was now part of the largest homicide confession series in American history. More than one detective expressed disbelief. They never expected closure. They never expected answers. And now answers were arriving in the form of a man nearly 80 years old, sitting in a wheelchair and calmly confessing to murder. The most surreal aspect came from his drawings. When the FBI released the sketches he created from memory, the public reacted with equal parts shock and sorrow. Each portrait showed a woman with gentle eyes and soft shadows around her jawline. They were not grotesque. They were not violent. They looked like portraits drawn by someone who cared. That contradiction unsettled me. Little remembered his victims through the lens of an artist, not a monster. He sketched them as if capturing beauty rather than tragedy. But the truth behind the images was unforgiving. These were not muses. They were evidence. And each drawing carried the weight of a life stolen. One sketch in particular caught my attention. A woman with short, curly hair, wearing hoop earrings, her expression calm. Little claimed she lived in the Gulf Coast region and that he had met her in the early 1980s. The portrait had a familiarity to it. Investigators cross-referenced missing persons reports, unidentified remains, and archived newspaper clippings. After weeks of searching, a potential match appeared. A woman reported missing in Pascagoula, Mississippi, around the same time. Her family had waited decades for answers, and now a drawing, sketched by the man who murdered her, might be the key to giving her name back. This is the cruel contradiction of homicide work. Sometimes, the road to justice is paved with the confessions of those least deserving of forgiveness. As the interviews continued, a pattern emerged in Little's descriptions of his victims. He did not view them as prey. He viewed them as companions in fleeting moments. He would talk to them, laugh with them, sometimes spend hours with them before violence struck. But his tenderness was an illusion. It was the velvet that covered the blade. He used familiarity as a way to lower defenses. He became two men, one who offered conversation and one who took life. Investigators, studying his behavior, noticed something else. His memory for landscapes was flawless. He could describe a street that had been demolished 30 years earlier. He could recall where a river bend met a gravel patch near a rural road. He could paint with words the architecture of a building that no longer existed. For most criminals, time erodes detail. For Little, time sharpened it. His memories remained perfectly preserved in the vault of his mind, untouched by age or guilt. This led to one of the most complicated questions of the investigation. Was Samuel Little a reliable narrator of his own crimes? He was accurate often enough to be credible, but he was inconsistent often enough to require caution. The truth lay somewhere in the overlap, in the place where memory and evidence intersected. Detectives combed through his statements line by line, verifying or disproving each claim. Some cases aligned perfectly with his confession. Others contained gaps impossible to fill. During one interview, he recounted meeting a woman at a bar in North Florida. According to his memory, she wore a green dress with a ripped hem and talked about wanting to start a new life somewhere else. He described how he drove her to a wooded area outside the city. Investigators Cross referenced his story with a case file from 1984. The autopsy report listed a Jane Doe found in a forested area, but the clothing description did not match. Had he misremembered? Had two memories blended? Or was this a different woman entirely, whose case had not yet been located in the archives? Each possibility churned through the minds of analysts, creating new paths for exploration. This is the price of interviewing a killer whose crimes spanned half a century. The past is a fog. Footprints fade, witnesses vanish, buildings crumble, names dissolve. Sometimes the only thing left standing is the killer's memory, distorted by time but still frighteningly vivid. As I watched hours of footage, I realized something that unsettled me deeply. Samuel Little was not recounting crimes. He was recounting a life defined not by milestones, but by murders. He measured time through victims, not calendars. His journey across America was not a sequence of dates. It was a sequence of deaths. One afternoon, after nearly 10 hours straight of reviewing interviews, I stepped outside the precinct to breathe. The sun felt too bright. The street noise felt distant. My mind was filled with faces drawn in pencil, with names half-whispered, with cities I had never visited, but now knew through the lens of tragedy. For the first time in years, I felt the emotional weight of the job settle into my bones. Detectives are taught to maintain distance, to separate themselves from the darkness they investigate. But the scale of this case made distance impossible, and yet, beneath the sadness, there was purpose. Each confession verified was a door opening for a family. Each identification was a truth restored. Each confirmation was another strike of justice against the silence that had protected him for so long. The turning point of the investigation came when the FBI officially declared Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in American history based on confirmed victims and credible confessions. The announcement reverberated across the nation. Some reacted with shock, some with disbelief, others with a quiet recognition that this was not just a story of one man's violence, but a story of systemic failures. The women he killed did not slip through the cracks. They were pushed through them by societal neglect. As the second chapter of our documentary closes, I ask you to picture a man sitting in a prison chair, speaking softly about the women he killed, as though recounting a distant dream. I ask you to picture investigators across the country holding outdated case files, their hands trembling as puzzle pieces, missing for decades, suddenly fall into place. and I ask you to remember this. Samuel Little did not operate in darkness alone. The darkness was made of neglect, silence, and forgotten victims. This is the work of detectives, to bring light to the places where the world has refused to look, to hear the voices of those who were silenced long before justice ever arrived, and to ensure that their stories, once uncovered, will never again be buried. This is Episode 2, and we are still only scratching the surface of the truth. There is a moment in every major investigation when the pieces stop lying flat on the table and begin rising into three-dimensional form. Patterns take shape, faces align with names, and the fog that once obscured the path forward lifts just enough to reveal the next few steps. In the search for the truth behind Samuel Little's confessions, that moment came unexpectedly for me, not in the form of evidence, but in the form of silence, a silence so profound, so deliberate, that it felt like the echo of the victims themselves, urging us deeper into the labyrinth. I had spent weeks sifting through transcripts, crime scene photographs, old autopsy reports, and sketches drawn by Little's own hand. But the more material I reviewed, the clearer it became that we were not working with a normal suspect. Little had lived through decades of violence, drifting across America like a ghost, with no fixed address, no financial ties, and no predictable routine. To understand him, we needed to follow the rhythm of his life, not the logic of standard police procedure. We had to trace the moments where he temporarily rooted himself, even for a night, because in those spaces, tragedy often bloomed. One evening, as I sat in the dim glow of my office lamp, I found myself returning to a particularly haunting portion of an interview conducted in Texas. Little had leaned back in his wheelchair, eyes half closed, as he described meeting a woman on the outskirts of New Orleans sometime in the early 1980s. His recollection was not linear. It drifted like smoke. He spoke of a bar that no longer existed, of a dirt road washed out by hurricanes, of the sound of jazz floating from open windows. And then, almost casually, he mentioned a detail so precise it pierced through the haze. He remembered the woman humming a song he could not name. He described her voice as soft and hopeful, as though she were singing to herself rather than to him. Most killers do not remember hope. They remember control, they remember fear, they remember anger. But Little remembered her humming. That was when I understood something fundamental about him. His violence did not erase his memories. It preserved them. He remembered his victims with the clarity of an archivist cataloging a collection. He remembered light, not just darkness, beauty, not just brutality. And that made him far more difficult to analyze. A man who remembers tenderness in the moments before he kills is not guided by impulse. He is guided by ritual. When I looked up from the transcript that night, I realized how far-reaching the investigation had become. Teams in Mississippi, Florida, Ohio, Arizona, California, and dozens of other states were simultaneously working to match his words with old records. The FBI's analysts were building a digital map of Little's travels, layering confession timelines over historical data, lodging receipts, weather conditions, and known sightings. And in every jurisdiction, one truth echoed loudly. The victims Little chose were almost invisible to the world around them. Their disappearances did not cause headlines. Their absences were not met with urgent searches. Many of them lived lives on the margins, where vulnerability was a constant companion. This realization shaped the third stage of the investigation. We were no longer looking merely for crimes. We were looking for women whose stories had remained unclaimed for decades. Women whose names had been spoken only by family members who had long given up hope, women who had become statistics in annual crime reports, buried beneath categories like undetermined cause or unidentified remains. These were not just cold cases, they were frozen lives. I shifted my focus from the confirmed victims to the uncertain ones, the cases resting in the gray space between memory and evidence. The weight of that gray space was enormous. Tens of thousands of unsolved homicides existed in the United States, many from the same era during which Little roamed freely. Untangling which ones belonged to him required patience, bordering on obsession. One morning, around 4 a.m., I found myself referencing a 1984 newspaper clipping from the Gulf Coast with a confession Little gave Washington authorities in 2018. The victim descriptions were not identical, but the settings were eerily similar. A woman traveling alone, a rural road, a sudden disappearance. No body ever recovered. I remember staring at the newspaper photograph, a grainy image of a woman smiling with her hand on her hip, the background faded by age. Under her picture was a sentence that burned into my memory. Family hope she is still alive. It had been almost 40 years since that sentence was printed, and now, at last, there was a sliver of truth to uncover, even if the truth would break what remained of their hope. This was the emotional tightrope investigators walked every day. When a confession aligned with a family's long unanswered grief, we had to be careful not to rush, careful not to make promises, careful not to misinterpret memories clouded by time, and yet careful also not to dismiss the possibility that closure, however painful, was finally within reach. As multiple agencies brought forward their cases, I was struck by how the pattern of Little's crimes revealed not just a killer's path, but a portrait of America's forgotten neighborhoods. He murdered in places where the streetlights flickered or didn't exist at all. He murdered in communities weighed down by poverty, addiction, and systemic neglect. He murdered in alleys behind liquor stores, in motels with paid-by-the-hour rooms, on abandoned lots where the grass grew tall enough to hide a body for days. His crimes were inextricably tied to the spaces society overlooked. One detective from Florida told me something I will never forget. He said that Little had a talent for reading people, not in the way a psychologist might, but in the way a predator senses vulnerability. According to Little's own accounts, many of his victims were women who trusted him, even if only for a moment. He offered them kindness for minutes at a time, and for some, that was enough to disarm them. In his own twisted way, he created moments of comfort before extinguishing the life before him. This duality, this ability to shift from companion to killer within seconds, made him a uniquely dangerous predator. To deepen our understanding of his behavioral patterns, I requested access to decades of arrest logs, jail records, and witness statements from states he traveled through. These documents revealed a man constantly in conflict with the law, but rarely detained long enough for thorough questioning, drunk and disorderly assault, theft, loitering, prostitution, related disputes. None of these charges hinted at the violent legacy he was building. He was a man hiding in plain sight, blending into the very margins he exploited. Another breakthrough came when I revisited Little's childhood and adolescence. I learned that he grew up moving frequently, shifting between relatives, attending segregated schools, often falling behind, and rarely forming lasting connections. He developed a sharp eye for the unspoken rules of survival. He learned when to be invisible. He learned when to palm. He learned when to charm. He learned when to flee. These traits evolved into tools for predation in adulthood. He could sense when a woman was alone, when she was hurt, when she was looking for companionship, when she was desperate for a small gesture of kindness. He weaponized empathy, and that realization chilled me to my core, because empathy, in its pure form, is humanity's greatest virtue. But in the hands of someone like Little, it became bait. The third phase of the investigation stretched far beyond the walls of interrogation rooms. It extended into morgues, archives, abandoned lots, and families' memories. Forensic teams revisited burial sites where unidentified women had been interred decades earlier. Anthropologists reconstructed skeletal remains using modern techniques, hoping to find clues that matched Little's memories. In some cases, DNA was extracted for the first time. In others, despite our best efforts, time had erased too much. There was a day when I accompanied a forensic anthropologist to a cemetery where multiple unidentified women were buried in a row of simple markers. No names, only numbers. The markers were small, perhaps 8 inches tall, and made of weather-worn concrete. Standing before them, I felt the weight of the investigation pressing heavily against my chest. How many of these women were Little's victims? How many were victims of others? How many died unnoticed? I touched one of the markers gently, my fingers brushing over the engraved digits. The air was quiet, but my mind buzzed with questions that history had tried to bury. Later that week, we received confirmation that one of Little's confessions matched a case from Tennessee where a woman had been found near a riverbank in 19,985. The family had spent years searching for answers. When they were informed about the connection to Little, their reaction was not anger. It was exhaustion. After decades of uncertainty, even the harshest truth can become a form of release. I listened as the lead detective recounted the family's words. They said, "We always knew she didn't just disappear. We just never knew who took her from us." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Disappearance is not an act of magic. It is an act of violence. And Samuel Little built a life out of making people disappear. As new information continued to flow in, the scale of Little's potential crimes expanded beyond what any of us initially imagined. His confessions were not random. They followed a pattern shaped by geography, poverty, and opportunity. He visited cities during peak periods of social unrest or economic downturns. He struck during seasons when policing resources were stretched thin. He exploited the vulnerabilities of women living near highways, ports, and industrial districts. His methods were simple, but they were devastatingly effective in a society unprepared to protect its most marginalized members. The psychological toll on the investigation team was enormous. Detectives who had spent entire careers trying to solve individual murders were suddenly confronted with the possibility that dozens of deaths they once investigated might be connected to a single man. Cold case units across the nation reported increased stress, sleepless nights, and emotional fatigue. I experienced the same symptoms, not because of the horrors we uncovered, but because of the weight of responsibility that came with them. One evening, as I stared once again at the map pinned to my wall, I felt something shift inside me. It was not clarity, it was resolve. Resolve to push deeper into the labyrinth, to honor the dead by refusing to look away, to ensure that even if we could not identify every victim, we would still try. Because trying is what separates justice from indifference. The deeper we moved into Samuel Little's past, the clearer the truth became. His murders were not isolated events. They were threads woven into a larger fabric of American history, a history marked by inequality, silence, and systemic failure. Little exploited those failures, but he did not create them. His violence thrived because society allowed certain lives to go unseen. This is the heart of Episode 3. It is not about Samuel Little the man. It is about the world that enabled him. It is about the victims who trusted the wrong stranger. It is about the detectives who spent decades searching in the dark. It is about the families who grieved without answers. And it is about the painful realization that justice delayed is not only justice denied, but also justice that must be reclaimed piece by piece from the ruins of time. As we close this chapter, I ask you to imagine one more scene. A room filled with old case files, stacked from floor to ceiling. Each file represents a woman whose life was cut short. Some of those files contain answers. Some contain only questions. And somewhere in the middle of that room stands a detective holding a sketch drawn by a killer, trying to match a face to a name before time erases the possibility forever. That detective is me, and the work is far from over. This is Episode 3. The darkness is deepening, but so is our determination to confront it. There is a point in every investigation when the past begins to pulse with new life, as if events that occurred decades ago suddenly exhale and make themselves known again. For me, that point arrived when the Texas Rangers invited me to sit in on a series of detailed review sessions regarding Little's confessions. It was early morning, the kind of morning that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, and the briefing room was dimly lit. On the wall, a projector displayed a frozen frame of Samuel Little's face during an interview. His eyes were half closed, his mouth curled slightly upward, as though he were drifting between memory and dream. I remember staring at that image longer than I intended. It felt like he was listening somehow, waiting for us to catch up to the truth he had been hoarding his entire life. The lead ranger began reviewing the latest transcripts. Little had confessed to another cluster of murders, this time in Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana. His descriptions included the humidity of the night air, the smell of gasoline near abandoned lots, the texture of gravel roads under old car tires. He spoke with such sensory precision that it was impossible not to feel transported into the environments he described. Yet the details that mattered most were buried beneath the poetic meandering of his recollections. To find the truth in his stories, we had to move slower than him, more carefully, like archaeologists brushing away layers of sediment to uncover artifacts long buried. As I listened, I realized something profound. Little was not confessing merely to relieve his conscience or to boast. He was confessing because he wanted to relive the past. He wanted to revisit the moments in which he felt most in control. These interviews were a performance stage, and he was both actor and audience, using memory as his script. The chilling part was that the murders were not, in his mind, the violent heart of the story. They were merely the end of a narrative he believed was shaped by connection, not cruelty. He spoke of the women he killed as though they were companions, even friends. This romanticization of his own predation made him impossibly difficult to pin down emotionally. When he smiled, it was not out of malice, it was out of nostalgia. Throughout the briefing, investigators raised questions, debated interpretations, and cross-referenced timestamps from interviews. But what struck me most were the silences between our discussions. Silences where each person in the room quietly confronted the enormity of the task before us. We were, collectively, trying to reconstruct 50 years of hidden violence based on the memories of a man whose mind had become a vault of distorted truths. To succeed, we needed to treat each confession like a constellation individual points of light that required careful mapping before forming patterns. After the meeting, I spent several hours reviewing the confessions tied specifically to Georgia. One account concerned a woman he met near a truck stop outside Macon. The way he described her was almost tender. He said she carried herself with dignity, even though life had obviously not been kind to her. She spoke about wanting to move north, maybe start over in a bigger city. He remembered the way she smiled at him, not because she trusted him, but because she was tired of not smiling at anyone. That detail haunted me. I tried to imagine the weight she carried, the loneliness she must have felt moments before her life was stolen. It is one thing to analyze crimes. It is another to imagine the final emotions of those whose lives became data. To verify his account, I contacted authorities who had worked in the region during that time. One retired officer remembered responding to a call near the truck stop around the same era. A woman had been reported missing, but because she did not have close family nearby, and because she lived transiently, the case never progressed. Her name was listed briefly in a local database before being swallowed by years of neglect. When I heard this, I realized how systemic invisibility had become the invisible partner in Little's crimes. He chose women who had long been ignored by society, and in doing so, he ensured that their disappearances never ignited the alarms necessary to catch him. Later that week, I traveled to Florida to review files related to another confession. The humidity clung to the air like a heavy blanket, and the streets smelled faintly of salt and oil. I walked through neighborhoods that Little once visited, places where laughter from open windows mingled with the distant rumble of passing trains. In one of these neighborhoods, I met with a local detective who had spent 2 decades working homicides. He greeted me with tired eyes but a firm handshake. He told me he never expected the case on his desk from 1980 to be connected to a serial killer who had crossed the entire country. When he pulled out the file, dust puffed into the air, and I felt as though time itself had been waiting for us to return. Inside were photographs of a young woman whose death had never been solved. She had been found near a marsh, partially concealed by reeds. At the time, the death was attributed to undetermined means. There were no defensive wounds, no clear signs of trauma, and no witnesses. But Little's confession added context that had been absent for decades. He described her earrings, the sound of her voice, the way she stepped carefully across wet ground, details unknown to the original investigators. It was not enough for conviction, but it was enough for recognition. For the first time in 40 years, we knew the likely shape of her final moments. The detective looked at me and said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said, "These cases don't die. They just wait." His words struck me deeply because I understood their truth. Cases do wait. They wait for someone to care again. They wait for science to advance. They wait for a mistake, a confession, a breakthrough. They wait for justice, even if justice arrives as a whisper instead of a shout. By the middle of the month, I had traveled through 3 states, reviewing records, conducting interviews, and walking through neighborhoods frozen in time. At each stop, I encountered the same combination of sorrow and gratitude from law enforcement officials who had long feared their cases would remain unsolved forever. But along with relief came another emotion: guilt. Many detectives felt guilty that their departments had not done more decades earlier. Guilty that their victims had been lost in the shuffle of overworked caseloads and societal biases. Guilty that a man like Samuel Little had been able to walk so freely for so long. I often found myself reassuring them, though the reassurance never felt sufficient. I told them that their failures were not personal, but systemic. That the world was different, then. That policing was different then. That resources were scarce and cases involving marginalized women rarely received the attention they deserved. But even as I said it, I wondered how many crimes throughout history had remained hidden for the same reason. How many predators learned, as little did, that society's blind spots were fertile hunting grounds. One evening, as I sat alone in my hotel room reviewing transcripts, I encountered a confession that shook me in a way others had not. Little described a woman he met in Mississippi during the late 1970s. Unlike many accounts where he could not recall names, he remembered hers. He said she told him her name, as though offering it as a gift, something soft and fragile. He described how she laughed at her own jokes, how she held her purse close to her ribs, how she walked with a slight limp. He remembered how she trusted him enough to accept a ride. And then, with the same softness in his voice, he described her death. I closed the transcript and sat in silence for several minutes. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I realized that the emotional toll of the investigation was no longer confined to daylight hours. It had followed me into the quiet spaces of my life, into hotel rooms, into late-night reflections, into the realm where professional boundaries blur into human grief. For the rest of the night, I found myself wondering whether anyone had ever looked for her, whether someone still remembered her name, whether someone had once waited on a porch, expecting her to return. The following day, I called a historian who specialized in Southern communities during the era little referenced. She provided context that clarified many of the socioeconomic conditions affecting women in those regions: high poverty rates, limited access to shelters, racial tensions, frequent migration for seasonal work. All of these factors contributed to the disappearances going unnoticed. Little had chosen environments where invisibility was already built into everyday life. His crimes blended into the background because the background was already full of struggle. The historian told me that in some communities, a woman could disappear and no official report would ever be filed. Friends might worry, neighbors might ask questions. But unless a family member insisted, law enforcement often never knew. These gaps in societal structure became cracks that Little slipped through again and again. Around this time, the FBI sent word that they had matched another one of Little's sketches to a missing persons case from Arkansas. The match was preliminary but promising. I studied the sketch closely. It showed a woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold both defiance and sadness. She looked alive on paper, vibrant. The FBI's image analyst told me that Little sometimes drew women more beautifully than they had appeared in real life, enhancing their features as though offering them dignity in death. That idea unsettled me. The notion that a killer might try to immortalize his victims through beauty rather than brutality. But I also understood that the sketches, despite their disturbing origin, were giving families answers they never expected to receive. By now, the national media was covering the investigation. Reporters wanted interviews. Documentaries were being planned. Families of missing women were calling hotlines, asking if their loved ones might be among Little's victims. The noise surrounding the case grew louder each day. But inside the investigation, a quiet intensity had taken hold. We knew that time was limited. Little was in failing health. If we wanted more answers, they had to come soon. As I prepared to return to Texas for another round of interviews, I thought about the women whose stories we had finally begun to piece together. Women who had been seen only through the lens of their struggles, addiction, poverty, homelessness, but who were now being restored as individuals with dreams, desires, and histories. Each identification was a reminder that these were not merely victims of a killer. They were victims of a society that had not protected them. By the end of the month, I understood that the fourth stage of this investigation was not about crime, solving in the traditional sense. It was about witnessing. It was about reconstructing lives from fragments. It was about giving voice to those who had been erased. It was about holding a mirror to the country and asking, how did we let this happen? How did we not see how many other lives have disappeared into the quiet corners of our maps? And it was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that Samuel Little was not just a criminal anomaly. He was a symptom of systems failing simultaneously, a symptom of neglect, a symptom of prejudice, a symptom of silence. As we close episode 4, I ask you to picture a map of the United States, not with borders or highways, but with names. Names that were once spoken with love, names forgotten, names still missing, names waiting to be reclaimed. The map is not complete yet, but we are filling it in. One name at a time, one truth at a time, one voice at a time. This is episode 4, and the deepest part of the labyrinth is still ahead. By the time I began preparing for my final trip to California, where Samuel Little was serving his sentence and living out the last chapter of his life, I realized something I had not acknowledged before. This investigation was no longer about a killer. It had become a meditation on memory, loss, and the ways in which entire lives can vanish into quiet corners of society. The closer we came to the end, the more I understood that confronting Little face to face would not be a pursuit of revelation. It would be a confrontation with the limits of what justice can truly restore. The morning I arrived at the California State Prison, the sky was a dull gray, the kind of gray that robs the world of its edges. A guard led me through a series of gates and corridors until I reached the medical wing where Little resided. He was frail, much smaller than I expected. Age had folded him inward as though he were shrinking toward the center of himself. His eyes, however, remained alert, observant, calculating. When he looked at me, it felt as though he were studying not who I was, but what I carried. The files, the questions, the burdens. I introduced myself. He nodded slowly, his breathing shallow. A nurse adjusted a monitor beside him, and for a moment, we both watched the green line jump steadily across the screen. The rhythm of a man who had lived long enough to bury his secrets, only to have them unearthed in the twilight of his life. I asked if he felt ready to speak again. He shrugged, as though speaking or remaining silent were equally pleasant options. Then he said something I had not anticipated. He said, "I don't remember their names, but I remember their faces. I remember the way they looked at me. I always remember that." His voice had no tremor of guilt, no quiver of shame. He spoke as if describing a distant memory of childhood friends. His recollection of faces was not the memory of a man haunted by his crimes, but the memory of a collector remembering his possessions. There was a meticulousness to his tone, the careful cadence of a man who believed that memory itself was a form of ownership. I asked whether he understood why it mattered to identify the women he described. He turned his head slightly, regarding me with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Then he said, "You want to put names where I left blanks. That's fine. But I didn't live my life with names. I lived it with moments. Moments." That word echoed in my mind long after he said it. Little's life was composed of moments that belonged to him, while the names belonged to history, to grief, to the families he had shattered. Moments were private. Names were public. And in the spaces between those two realms lay the tragedy of every one of his victims. As the interview progressed, I found myself watching the room more than watching him. The chipped paint on the walls, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the sterile scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. It felt strangely symbolic. This sterile environment, this place designed for order and containment, was holding a man whose life had been defined by chaos and invisibility. For decades, he had lived in the shadows. Now he was bathed in the harsh brightness of truth, exposed at last, but far too late for the women whose lives he had extinguished. He continued speaking, though his voice weakened. He described a woman he met in Texas who liked to braid her hair with blue ribbons, a woman in Ohio who told him she dreamed of becoming a photographer, another in Florida who carried a picture of her son in her shoe because she was afraid someone would steal it. The details poured out like water through cupped hands, precious, fragile, impossible to hold all at once. At times, he paused, trying to recall something that hovered beyond the reach of his mind. When I asked if he felt remorse, he frowned as though I had asked a meaningless question. "Remorse isn't something I know," he said simply. "It wasn't a part of my life." The simplicity of his answer struck harder than any overt confession. Remorse wasn't part of his life. Not ever, not for a moment. For him, remorse was as foreign as mercy. As the conversation continued, I grew more aware of the clock ticking behind us. Time was running out, not for the investigation, but for him, for the chance to ask questions no one else had the opportunity to ask. I leaned forward and asked him if he ever feared being caught. He chuckled, the sound brittle and almost fragile. "Fear is for people who think someone is watching them," he replied. "No one watched the women I chose, so no one watched me." That sentence encapsulated everything. He had not hidden because he was clever. He had hidden because the world had chosen not to see. When the interview ended, I walked down the long corridor toward the exit. My steps echoed against the cold floor. I thought about the families who would never hear certain answers because the details had faded from his memory or because time had buried the evidence too deeply. I thought about the detectives who had retired believing their cases would remain unsolved forever. I thought about the women whose absence had never sparked the kind of urgency their lives deserved. Outside, the gray sky was still hanging low. A car waited to take me back to the airport, but I paused before entering, letting the air settle around me. I realized that this investigation had not only revealed truths about a serial killer, it had revealed truths about the country he moved through, a country where some lives shine brightly enough to demand justice, while others flicker so faintly that their disappearance becomes part of the background noise. In the following weeks, Little's health continued to decline. The reports from the prison medical staff became shorter, more urgent, until one morning the call arrived. Samuel Little was dead. I sat in my office for a long time after receiving the news. The hum of the city outside my window felt distant, muted. The death of a killer rarely brings closure. It brings finality, but not clarity. For investigators, death closes the door on answers we might have uncovered had we had more time. For families, it closes the door on accountability, denying them the chance to look the man responsible in the eyes. And for society, it closes the door on a story that still has chapters left unwritten. Little died with secrets still buried inside him. Secrets we tried desperately to pull from his fading mind, but death sealed them away forever. The women he had not yet been able to name would remain mysteries, unless forensic breakthroughs allowed us to identify them. The map of his crimes would remain incomplete. The true number of his victims would remain uncertain. But amid that uncertainty, something remarkable happened. Across the nation, communities began reclaiming the names of women who had long been forgotten. Families reconnected with cold case detectives. Local newspapers revisited decades-old disappearances. Entire towns held vigils for victims they had never met. The investigation into Little's crimes had become more than an attempt at justice. It had become a reckoning with history. In the months after his death, I visited several communities that had been touched by his violence. In each one, I met people who wanted to talk, not about Little, but about the girls and women whose stories had been erased. In Tennessee, a grandmother showed me a faded photograph of her niece, saying she hoped that someday we would identify her properly. In Mississippi, a pastor held a memorial service for unidentified victims, reading out numbers instead of names, because numbers were all that existed. In California, a woman whose sister disappeared in 1981 hugged me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for not forgetting us." Those encounters taught me something I had not fully understood until then. Justice is not always a courtroom. Sometimes justice is a conversation. Sometimes it is a name spoken aloud after decades of silence. Sometimes it is the acknowledgement that a life mattered even if the world failed to protect it. As this documentary reaches its final moments, I want to offer a truth that has followed me through every corner of this investigation. Samuel Little was not defined by the number of people he killed. He was defined by the number of people society failed to see. And his story forces us to look inward, to examine the structures and assumptions that allow violence to thrive unnoticed. When we talk about serial killers, we often focus on their pathology, their motives, their methods. But the story of Samuel Little demands that we shift our gaze. The true question is not how did he do it. The true question is how did we allow it to happen? The answer is complex, painful, and rooted in inequality. But recognizing it is the first step toward preventing it from happening again. As I close this chapter of my career, I think often of a field notebook I carried during my travels. Its pages are worn, filled with names, dates, sketches, and notes. Near the end, on a page marked only by a number, I wrote a single sentence that now feels like the only way to conclude this journey. We owe the dead more than remembrance. We owe them change, because remembrance honors the past. But change protects the future. This is episode 5, and this story, though it ends here, must never be forgotten.